On the afternoon of December 15th, 2025, the courtroom in Dedham, Massachusetts was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if every breath had been suspended in the air. Brian Walshe sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes
by
fixed
saying that
forward.
Ana left
He did
their
not
home
turn
on
when the jury
January
filed in.
1st to take a
He did
ride
not
share
look
to
at the
the
gallery
airport,
filled with
then heading
reporters,
to Washington,
prosecutors,
D.C. for
or
work,
members of
but
Ana
they
Walshe's
also
family.
revealed that her phone
When the clerk
pinged
asked
near
for
the
the
home
verdict,
both on
the
New Year's
foreperson
Day and the
stood
day
and spoke
after.
just three words
Prosecutors
that would
also
end
said
nearly
police
3 years of
surveilled
uncertainty. Guilty of murder in the first degree. According to court records, it was the first time the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office had secured a first-degree murder conviction without ever recovering a victim's body. For many watching, the verdict felt like an ending. For investigators, it was confirmation of what they had believed from the very beginning. And for Ana Walshe's 3 young sons, it was the closest thing to justice they might ever know. But to understand how this case reached that moment, investigators say you have to go back to a quiet New Year's morning in a small coastal town when a woman vanished without leaving a trace. Ana Walshe was 39 years old, a successful real estate executive, a mother of 3, and by all outward appearances, a woman in the middle of a demanding but carefully balanced life. She was born in Belgrade, Serbia, and later moved to the United States, where she built a career with the global real estate firm Tishman Speyer. According to colleagues, Ana was disciplined, detail-oriented, and deeply committed to her work. She managed properties across the Washington, District of Columbia region and frequently traveled between Massachusetts and the capital. Friends described her as devoted to her children and fiercely protective of her independence. She was married to Brian Walshe, an art dealer who presented himself as a businessman and family man. Together, they lived in Cohasset, Massachusetts, a quiet seaside community where crime was rare and neighbors generally knew one another. They had 3 sons, all under the age of 7 at the time Ana disappeared. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, investigators would later uncover a marriage under strain. According to prosecutors, Brian Walshe had been living under intense pressure in the months leading up to Ana's disappearance. In the year 2021, he pleaded guilty in federal court to charges related to art fraud, admitting that he had sold forged Andy Warhol paintings. As a result, he was placed on house arrest at the Cohasset home while awaiting sentencing. Court records show that his movements were restricted and any travel outside the house required approval. Ana, meanwhile, continued traveling for work, often spending days at a time in Washington. According to people close to the couple, this arrangement created resentment and conflict. Investigators would later allege that Ana had begun discussing the possibility of separation and had consulted attorneys about her options. On the night of December 31st, 2022, Ana and Brian hosted a small New Year's Eve gathering at their home. According to police reports, only one close friend attended. There was no large party, no loud celebration, just dinner, conversation, and the countdown to midnight. Shortly after the new year began, the guests left the house. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny. According to Brian Walshe's initial statement to police, Ana received a phone call or message related to a work emergency in Washington. He claimed she needed to return immediately to handle an urgent matter and planned to take a rideshare to Logan International Airport. He told investigators that Ana left the house in the early morning hours of January 1st, 2023, carrying a small suitcase. He said he watched her go and believed she would be on a flight within hours. But according to prosecutors, that story began to fall apart almost immediately. Ana never arrived in Washington. She never boarded the flight she had booked for January 3rd. Her phone stopped registering into her movement shortly after she was last seen at home. Her credit cards, debit cards, and email accounts showed no activity after the early hours of New Year's Day. There was no record of any rideshare trip from the Walshe residence to the airport. And perhaps most troubling, no one outside the home ever reported seeing Ana again. For the first few days, her absence went largely unnoticed. Ana often traveled for work, and brief gaps in communication were not unusual. But by January 4th, when she failed to report to her job and missed scheduled meetings, her employer contacted police. That same day, Brian Walshe also contacted authorities to report his wife missing. According to investigators, he repeated the same account. Ana had left abruptly for Washington due to a work emergency. At that point, Cohasset police opened a missing person investigation. From the start, detectives focused on the timeline. They examined flight records, phone data, and financial transactions. What they found raised immediate red flags. Ana's phone had not moved beyond the immediate area of the home. There was no airport security footage of her passing through Logan. Her work laptop had not logged into company systems after New Year's Day. According to court filings, investigators quickly concluded that Ana never left Massachusetts. As the investigation continued, attention turned to Brian Walshe's own movements. According to prosecutors, his statements about where he was and what he did in the days following Ana's disappearance were inconsistent and, in some cases, directly contradicted by surveillance footage. Brian told police that on January 1st he stayed home or visited his mother in Swampscott, but license plate. Readers and store security cameras showed him traveling to multiple retail locations north and south of Cohasset. On January 2nd, 2023, surveillance footage captured Brian Walshe at a home improvement store in Danvers. According to prosecutors, he spent more than $400 on cleaning supplies, including items such as tarps, mops, and cleaning chemicals. Investigators would later note that these purchases occurred while Ana was still officially considered missing and before any public search efforts had begun. The following day, cameras recorded him visiting additional stores, including a home goods retailer. According to investigators, he appeared to be wearing gloves and a face covering. These movements were particularly significant because Brian Walshe was supposed to be under house arrest at the time. Court records show that he did not have permission to leave the residence. When confronted with this evidence, prosecutors alleged that Brian offered explanations that changed over time. On January 8th, 2023, just 1 week after Ana was last seen, Brian Walshe was arrested on charges of misleading police. At that point, authorities made it clear that they no longer viewed him as a cooperative spouse but as a central figure in the investigation. During the arrest, police executed search warrants at the Cohasset home. What they found would transform the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide inquiry. According to court testimony, investigators discovered bloodstains in the basement of the home. A knife recovered from the residence tested positive for human blood. Prosecutors would later state that forensic analysis linked that blood to Ana Walshe. In dumpsters across multiple towns, police recovered trash bags containing items investigators believed were connected to the crime. These included a damaged hacksaw, a hatchet, sections of carpeting, a Tyvek protective suit, and personal items belonging to Ana, such as footwear. According to prosecutors, DNA testing confirmed that Ana's blood was present on several of these items. Perhaps the most chilling evidence came from Brian Walshe's own electronic devices. Court records reveal that investigators recovered internet search histories that prosecutors described as deeply incriminating. In the days immediately following Ana's disappearance, searches allegedly included phrases such as how long before a body starts to smell, how to dispose of a body, and whether someone could be charged with murder if a body was never found. Prosecutors would later argue that these searches demonstrated planning, not panic. Despite the mounting evidence, Ana's body was never recovered. Investigators believe it was dismembered and disposed of in multiple locations to prevent discovery. According to prosecutors, this deliberate effort to erase physical evidence was the reason the case relied so heavily on circumstantial and digital proof. The absence of a body would become a central theme of the defense's strategy. In the months that followed, Brian Walshe was formally indicted on charges of murder and improper disposal of a human body. He pleaded not guilty to murder but later admitted guilt to charges of misleading police and unlawful disposal of remains, according to court records. Those admissions marked the first time he publicly acknowledged that Ana was dead. As the case moved toward trial, it captured national attention. Legal analysts debated whether prosecutors could secure a conviction without a body. True crime communities dissected every detail, from the timeline of purchases to the psychological profile of the suspect. For Ana's family, the process was a slow and painful wait for accountability. Before we continue deeper into how investigators built their case, uncovered motive, and presented their theory to the jury, take a moment to support Dark Case Desk. If you value detailed, fact-driven true crime storytelling, please like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that demand to be heard. This case was only beginning to reveal its darkest layers. In part 2, investigators begin to reconstruct what they believe happened inside the Walshe home during the final hours Ana was seen alive, and the prosecution's theory of motive starts to take shape. Investigators say the most unsettling part of this case was not what they could prove, but what they had to reconstruct piece by piece. With no body recovered and no direct witnesses, the timeline of Ana Walshe's final hours had to be built from fragments: phone data, purchase receipts, surveillance footage, and Brian Walshe's own statements, many of which shifted as the investigation progressed. According to prosecutors, it was this slow accumulation of small, seemingly ordinary details that ultimately revealed an extraordinary crime. Court records show that in the days before New Year's Eve, tensions inside the Walshe household were high. Brian Walshe was facing a federal sentencing that could result in significant prison time. Prosecutors argued that Ana was becoming increasingly frustrated with being the sole financial provider while also managing childcare and frequent travel. Witnesses close to Ana told investigators that she had begun documenting her concerns and had discussed the possibility of divorce. According to prosecutors, Ana had also recently updated her will and explored life insurance policies, decisions they described as precautionary but relevant to establishing motive. The prosecution's theory centered on the idea that Brian Walshe felt trapped. According to court filings, investigators believe he saw Ana not only as emotionally distant, but as a direct threat to his freedom and financial stability. If she left him, prosecutors argued, he would lose access to her income, face sentencing alone, and potentially be exposed further in his fraud case. In court, prosecutors alleged that Brian stood to benefit financially from Ana's death through life insurance policies totaling millions of dollars, though the defense would later argue those policies were not immediately accessible. The night of December 31st, 2022 became the focal point of the trial. Prosecutors walked jurors through a minute-by-minute reconstruction of events after the New Year's Eve guests left the home. According to investigators, Ana and Brian were alone in the house. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors reported disturbances, but forensic evidence later suggested that something violent occurred inside the basement of the home. According to testimony from state forensic analysts, blood spatter patterns discovered in the basement were consistent with a violent altercation rather than an accident. Prosecutors alleged that Ana was killed inside the home during the early hours of January 1st. They did not specify an exact cause of death, but argued that the extent of blood evidence suggested fatal injuries. Investigators believe Brian then began a methodical process of cleanup and disposal designed to delay discovery and confuse investigators. The defense countered this narrative by arguing that Ana may have died unexpectedly of natural causes and that Brian panicked. But prosecutors pointed out that panic alone did not explain the sequence of actions that followed. According to court records, Brian's internet searches in the hours and days after Ana's disappearance showed a pattern of research focused on decomposition, body disposal, and legal consequences. Prosecutors argued that these searches demonstrated forethought and awareness, not shock. Investigators testified that Brian's phone showed activity throughout the early morning hours of January 1st. Location data placed the phone inside the home during the time prosecutors alleged the killing occurred. There was no evidence of Ana's phone leaving the residence. According to investigators, Ana's device stopped generating meaningful data shortly after midnight, suggesting it was powered down or destroyed. By the afternoon of January 1st, Brian's behavior became increasingly suspicious. According to surveillance footage presented at trial, he was seen leaving the home despite being under house arrest. Prosecutors allege he used his mother's vehicle and phones to avoid detection. License plate readers and security cameras tracked him traveling between Cohasset, Swampscott, Danvers, and other surrounding towns. On January 2nd, prosecutors say Brian began purchasing items specifically suited for cleaning and dismemberment. Court records list purchases that included heavy-duty trash bags, tarps, cleaning chemicals, a hatchet, and a hacksaw. Investigators testified that these tools were later recovered, damaged, and separated from dumpsters miles apart. Prosecutors argued this separation was deliberate, intended to reduce the chance that all evidence would be found in one location. Dumpster surveillance became a key element of the case. According to testimony, cameras captured Brian Walshe disposing of large trash bags at multiple locations over several days. One particularly significant video showed him throwing a heavy bag into a dumpster at an apartment complex in Abington. Investigators later recovered items from that dumpster containing Ana Walshe's DNA. The forensic analysis was meticulous. Crime lab experts testified that blood found on the recovered tools matched Ana's genetic profile. Prosecutors emphasized that this was not trace transfer but substantial biological material. The presence of Ana's blood on cutting tools, combined with Brian's purchases and internet searches, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Throughout the investigation, Brian Walshe continued to speak with police, but according to court records, his statements evolved. Initially, he insisted Ana left for Washington. Later, he acknowledged she never arrived. Eventually, he admitted to misleading investigators. By the time of trial, he conceded that Ana was dead, but maintained he was not responsible for her death. Prosecutors argued that these shifting narratives reflected consciousness of guilt. They pointed out that Brian never participated in searches for Ana and did not publicly appeal for help in finding her. According to investigators, he appeared more focused on explaining his own actions than locating his missing wife. As the case moved closer to trial, the absence of Ana's body became both a challenge and a strategy. Prosecutors acknowledged they could not show jurors where Ana's remains were, but they argued that modern investigations no longer depend solely on physical recovery. They emphasized digital footprints, forensic science, and behavioral evidence. For Ana's family, the months leading up to trial were marked by frustration and grief. Her relatives traveled from Serbia to attend court hearings. Statements entered into the record described a family devastated not only by loss, but by uncertainty. According to prosecutors, Ana's children were too young to testify, but their presence loomed over every proceeding. When the trial finally began, the courtroom became a stage for competing narratives. The prosecution presented Brian Walshe as calculating and methodical, a man who believed he could outsmart investigators. The defense portrayed him as flawed but overwhelmed, arguing that the state's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. As jurors listened, the question was no longer whether Ana Walshe was missing. Even the defense acknowledged she was gone. The question was how and whether the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Brian Walshe intentionally killed his wife. Before the jury could answer that question, they would need to hear the most powerful portion of the state's case, the digital trail, the courtroom testimony, and the moment prosecutors claimed Brian Walshe's own searches told a story he never meant to reveal. If you're finding this investigation as gripping as we are, take a moment to like this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments and hit the subscribe button for Dark Case Desk. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive and ensures the facts continue to be examined with care. In Part 3, the trial reaches its most intense phase as prosecutors present Brian Walshe's internet searches, surveillance footage, and forensic testimony, and the defense mounts its final challenge to a case built without a body. Here is Part 3 of 4. It continues without breaks, keeps the investigative documentary tone, remains fully ad safe, uses court record language, and spells all dates and numbers in words. As the trial entered its most consequential phase, prosecutors turned to the evidence they believed spoke louder than any witness ever could. According to court records, the state's case rested on a simple but unsettling argument. Brian Walshe did not need to confess because his actions, his movements, and his own digital footprint told the story for him. Jurors were reminded that modern crimes leave traces, and in this case, those traces formed a timeline that prosecutors said could not be explained away. One of the most heavily scrutinized pieces of evidence was Brian Walshe's internet search history. Prosecutors introduced records recovered from electronic devices seized during the investigation. According to testimony, the searches occurred in the hours and days immediately following Ana Walshe's disappearance. Jurors listened as an investigator read them aloud in court. How long before a body starts to smell? How to stop a body from decomposing? 10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to? Can you be charged with murder without a body? According to prosecutors, these searches were not isolated or accidental. They were specific, sequential, and timed closely with Brian's purchases of cleaning supplies and tools. The defense argued that these searches reflected panic rather than planning. They suggested Brian was in shock, overwhelmed by a tragic situation he did not know how to handle. But prosecutors countered that panic does not explain methodical research spread over multiple days, nor does it explain the calculated steps investigators say followed. According to court testimony, Brian did not call emergency services. He did not seek medical help. He did not notify authorities that his wife was in danger or deceased. Instead, prosecutors alleged he began researching how to make a body disappear. Digital evidence extended beyond search histories. Cell phone data placed Brian's devices in specific locations at specific times. Investigators testified that phones associated with Brian or his mother were used to move through multiple towns, often during hours when most people were asleep. Prosecutors argued that this pattern was deliberate, an attempt to obscure his true movements by avoiding use of his own monitored phone. Surveillance footage corroborated those movements. Cameras showed Brian entering and exiting stores, dumpsters, and parking lots. Each appearance added another layer to the timeline. Dumpster recovery became one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the trial. According to investigators, law enforcement teams searched through waste facilities across several towns, guided by surveillance timestamps and location data. From those dumpsters, they recovered items prosecutors said were directly connected to the crime. A hacksaw blade and handle found separated. A hatchet, its components discarded in different locations. A Tyvek protective suit, heavy-duty trash bags, and personal belongings identified as Ana Walshe's. Forensic experts testified that blood found on these items matched Ana's DNA. According to court records, this was not a partial match or a degraded sample. It was conclusive. Prosecutors emphasized that Ana's blood was found on tools designed to cut and clean. To the state, this was proof not just of death, but of dismemberment and deliberate concealment. The defense challenged the forensic conclusions, questioning whether contamination or secondary transfer could explain the presence of DNA. But prosecutors responded with testimony showing that the amount and location of biological material were inconsistent with innocent explanations. According to one expert witness, the blood patterns indicated direct contact rather than incidental transfer. Throughout this phase of the trial, Brian Walshe sat quietly at the defense table. He did not testify. His attorneys presented him as a flawed man who made poor decisions but did not commit murder. They argued that the state was asking jurors to fill in gaps with assumptions. No eyewitness, no confession, no body. The defense reminded jurors that circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, must still meet the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors responded by reframing the absence of a body. According to their closing arguments, the lack of remains was not a weakness, but evidence of intent. They argued that the very reason Ana's body was never recovered was because Brian Walshe took extraordinary measures to ensure it would not be. In court, a prosecutor told jurors that dismemberment and disposal across multiple locations were acts designed to defeat law enforcement, not acts of panic. Witnesses also testified about Brian's behavior in the days after Ana vanished. According to investigators, he showed little concern for her whereabouts. He did not organize searches or appeal to the public. He did not contact friends or family asking for help. Instead, prosecutors alleged he focused on managing his own exposure, providing explanations that shifted as evidence contradicted them. One moment in the trial stood out to observers. A prosecutor displayed a timeline chart for the jury showing Brian's searches, purchases, and movements layered together. According to those records, each action followed the next in a sequence that prosecutors said revealed planning, not coincidence. The courtroom was silent as jurors studied the chart. The defense made one final attempt to reframe the narrative. They suggested Ana may have died unexpectedly and that Brian's actions afterward, while wrong, did not prove murder. But prosecutors reminded jurors that Brian himself had admitted to unlawfully disposing of Ana's body. According to court records, that admission alone established that Ana was dead and that Brian played a central role in concealing her remains. As closing arguments concluded, jurors were instructed on the law. They were told that they did not need to know the exact cause of death or recover a body to find guilt. They needed only to determine whether the evidence proved that Brian Walshe intentionally caused Ana's death and took steps to conceal it. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, their verdict reflected the weight of the evidence they had seen. Guilty of murder in the first degree. According to prosecutors, it was a verdict built on thousands of small details coming together to form one undeniable conclusion. Before we move into the aftermath of the verdict and the broader questions this case raised about justice without remains, take a moment to support Dark Case Desk. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue telling complex stories with accuracy and care. In part 4, we examine the sentencing, the reaction from Ana Walshe's family, the legal significance of a conviction without a body, and what this case means for future investigations. When the jury foreperson finished reading the verdict, the courtroom did not erupt in sound. There were no gasps, no shouts, no visible displays of emotion. According to reporters present, the room felt heavy, as though everyone understood that while a legal conclusion had been reached, nothing about the outcome felt complete. Brian Walshe remained seated, his posture rigid, his gaze forward. He did not turn toward Ana Walshe's family. He did not react when the judge thanked the jury for their service. In that moment, the years of investigation, speculation, and unanswered questions collapsed into a single reality. A man had been convicted of murdering his wife, and yet her body was still missing. According to court records, the judge ordered Brian Walshe to remain in custody pending sentencing, which was scheduled for later that same week. Prosecutors requested the mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, as required under Massachusetts law for first-degree murder convictions. The defense declined to make a statement immediately following the verdict, but later reiterated that they believed the evidence did not conclusively establish how Ana Walshe died. That argument, however, had already been rejected by the jury. For Ana Walshe's family, the verdict was both devastating and validating. In statements read into the record, relatives described Ana as a loving mother, a devoted daughter, and a woman who worked relentlessly to build a life for her children. They spoke of the agony of not knowing where her remains were, of being unable to bury her or say goodbye in a traditional sense. Prosecutors acknowledged this absence repeatedly, noting that while the legal system had reached its conclusion, the family's grief would remain unresolved for as long as Ana's body was missing. The sentencing hearing that followed brought a different kind of gravity to the case. According to court transcripts, the judge reviewed the evidence again, summarizing the factors that led to the conviction. He referenced the forensic findings, the digital evidence, the purchases, the disposal of items across multiple locations, and the admissions Brian Walshe had made regarding misleading investigators and unlawfully disposing of remains. The court emphasized that the planning and concealment involved elevated the crime to the highest degree under state law. When given the opportunity to speak, Brian Walshe declined to address the court directly. His attorneys spoke on his behalf, requesting that the court consider his role as a father and the impact of a life sentence on his children. Prosecutors responded by stating that Ana Walshe was also a parent and that her children had already suffered the most permanent loss imaginable. According to the judge, the court's responsibility was not to weigh sympathy, but to apply the law as written. Brian Walshe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As deputies led him out of the courtroom, the case that had dominated headlines for years formally entered its final legal chapter. But outside the courtroom, the conversation was far from over. Legal analysts immediately began discussing the significance of the verdict. According to experts, the conviction marked a rare but increasingly relevant example of a murder case successfully prosecuted without a body. Advances in forensic science, digital tracking, and behavioral analysis, they said, had changed the landscape of criminal investigations. Prosecutors involved in the case later explained that from the beginning, they had understood the challenges they faced. Without remains, there would be no cause of death, no autopsy, no physical confirmation of how Ana Walshe died. Instead, they relied on what they described as a convergence of evidence. Each individual piece might not have been sufficient on its own, but together they formed a narrative that jurors found compelling. The district attorney emphasized that this was not a case built on speculation. According to his statements, every claim presented at trial was supported by documented records, sworn testimony, or scientific analysis. The goal, he said, was not to tell a story, but to prove a sequence of actions beyond a reasonable doubt. Public reaction to the verdict was swift. True crime communities debated the implications. Some viewers expressed relief that accountability had been established. Others remained unsettled by the absence of Ana's body. Many asked the same question investigators had grappled with for years. Where is Ana Walshe? Law enforcement officials have stated that searches for Ana's remains have not officially ended. According to investigators, advances in landfill analysis and environmental scanning may one day provide new leads. However, they also acknowledge that the deliberate nature of the disposal makes recovery unlikely. Prosecutors have said that Brian Walshe never disclosed the location of Ana's remains, and there is no indication that he intends to do so. For Ana's children, the focus has shifted towards stability and privacy. Court records indicate that they are being raised by extended family members. The court sealed certain records to protect their identities and well-being. Prosecutors emphasized that the children were not witnesses in the trial and were shielded from the proceedings as much as possible. The broader legal community has taken note of the case. According to criminal justice scholars, the Walshe trial may be cited in future prosecutions involving extensive digital evidence and the absence of physical remains. It demonstrates, they argue, that intent and action can be proven through patterns of behavior, even when the most tangible form of evidence is missing. As one prosecutor stated during a post-trial interview, justice does not always come with closure. Sometimes it comes with accountability, and sometimes that is all the law can offer. Before we continue into the lasting impact of this case and the unanswered questions that still linger, take a moment to support Dark Case Desk. If you value careful, fact-based true crime storytelling, please like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your engagement helps ensure these stories are told responsibly and remembered accurately. The story of Ana Walshe did not end with a verdict. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a larger conversation about truth, evidence, and what justice looks like when certainty is incomplete. In the weeks following the sentencing, attention shifted from the courtroom to the larger implications of what the Brian Walshe case had revealed. According to legal analysts, this was not just a conviction, but a case study in how modern investigations now operate when traditional evidence is missing. The absence of Ana Walshe's body forced prosecutors to rely on a framework built almost entirely on behavior, technology, and forensic reconstruction. Investigators believe this approach represents a turning point, one where crimes once thought impossible to prove can now be prosecuted through digital footprints and pattern analysis. Prosecutors explained that from the earliest days of the investigation, they understood they would never be able to tell the jury exactly how Ana Walshe died. There would be no autopsy report, no medical examiner testimony describing cause of death. Instead, the case focused on what they described as irrefutable facts. Ana Walshe was alive inside her home on New Year's Eve, 2022, and she was never seen again. Her phone, finances, and travel records went silent. Her blood was later found on tools associated with cutting and cleaning, and Brian Walshe admitted under oath that he disposed of her body. According to prosecutors, this sequence alone established death, concealment, and intent. What elevated the charge to first-degree murder, they argued, was the planning that occurred afterward. The purchases, the internet searches, the multiple disposal locations, and the effort to mislead law enforcement all pointed to deliberation. In post-trial interviews, members of the prosecution team said the case underscored a simple principle. Intent can be inferred from actions taken before and after a crime. Defense attorneys and legal commentators, however, continued to debate the verdict. Some argued that cases without bodies always carry an inherent risk of wrongful conviction. They pointed to historical examples where missing persons later resurfaced and cautioned against over-reliance on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors responded by noting that Brian Walshe's own admissions distinguished this case from others. According to court records, he did not claim Ana was alive. He admitted she was dead and that he concealed her remains. The only question left for the jury was whether he caused her death intentionally. Public reaction reflected that divide. On social media and in online forums, some viewers focused on the horror of the alleged crime, while others fixated on the unanswered question of where Ana's body might be. Investigators acknowledge that uncertainty, but emphasize that justice systems are designed to weigh probability and evidence, not provide perfect answers to every question. The case also reignited discussions around domestic violence and coercive control. Advocacy groups pointed out that while the Walshe case did not involve prior public reports of abuse, it reflected a pattern seen in other domestic homicide cases: escalating stress, financial pressure, and control dynamics behind closed doors. According to experts, such factors often remain invisible until a crisis occurs. Ana Walshe's colleagues and friends spoke publicly for the first time after the verdict. They described her as driven, generous, and deeply committed to her children. Several noted that Ana had confided in them about feeling isolated and overwhelmed in the months before her disappearance. According to those statements, she was actively planning her future, both professionally and personally. Prosecutors cited this testimony as further evidence that Ana did not simply vanish by choice. International attention added another layer to the case. Because Ana Walshe was born in Serbia, her disappearance and death drew concern from Serbian officials and media outlets. According to court records, the Serbian consulate worked with Massachusetts authorities to keep her family informed throughout the proceedings. This international dimension highlighted how modern crimes can resonate far beyond the communities where they occur. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies across the country quietly took note of the investigative techniques used in the case. Training materials and legal seminars began referencing the Walshe prosecution as an example of effective evidence synthesis. According to investigators, the key lesson was not reliance on any single type of evidence, but the ability to connect disparate data points into a coherent narrative. Despite the conviction, questions remained unanswered. Investigators have acknowledged that without cooperation from Brian Walshe, the exact location of Ana's remains may never be known. According to officials, no credible tips have emerged since the verdict that would lead to recovery. Environmental factors, landfill operations, and the passage of time have all complicated efforts. For Ana's family, this uncertainty is perhaps the hardest burden. In statements released through their attorneys, they expressed gratitude to law enforcement and prosecutors while also emphasizing that closure remains incomplete. They spoke of the pain of not being able to lay Ana to rest, of explaining her absence to children who were too young to understand what had happened. The court addressed these realities during sentencing. According to transcripts, the judge acknowledged that while the legal process had reached its conclusion, the human consequences would continue. He emphasized that the sentence was not meant to heal wounds, but to affirm accountability under the law. As months passed, Brian Walshe was transferred to a state correctional facility to begin serving his life sentence. He will spend the remainder of his life in custody, with no eligibility for parole. According to correctional officials, he will have limited contact with the outside world, restricted communication privileges, and no opportunity to appeal the sentence except through formal legal channels. The appellate process remains a possibility. Defense attorneys have indicated they may pursue appeals based on evidentiary rulings and jury instructions. Prosecutors have stated they are confident the conviction will withstand review. Legal experts note that appeals in cases like this can take years and rarely overturn verdicts absent clear procedural errors. As the legal chapter slowly transitions into history, the Walshe case continues to raise broader questions about how society defines proof, guilt, and justice. It challenges the assumption that truth must always be tangible. Sometimes, investigators argue, truth is revealed through absence, through silence, and through patterns that cannot be explained away. If you're following this story closely, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button for Dark Case Desk. Your engagement helps keep careful, fact-driven discussions alive. In the next segment, Part 4C, we examine the unanswered questions that remain, the psychological dimensions of the case, and how investigators believe the crime unfolded behind closed doors. As the legal process faded into the background, investigators and analysts began asking a different set of questions, ones that could not be answered by verdicts or sentencing orders. How does a crime like this unfold inside an ordinary home without drawing attention? How does someone believe they can erase another human being so completely? And what does the Brian Walshe case reveal about the psychology of deception, control, and calculation? According to prosecutors, the most disturbing aspect of the case was not the violence itself, but the calm persistence that followed it. Investigators believed that once Ana Walshe was dead, Brian Walshe entered what they described as a problem-solving mode. Instead of reacting emotionally or seeking help, he focused on logistics. How to clean, what to buy, where to go, how to create distance between himself and the evidence. This behavioral shift, prosecutors argued, was consistent with someone attempting to manage a situation rather than escape it. Psychologists who later analyzed the case noted that such behavior often appears in crimes involving close relationships. According to experts, familiarity creates opportunity. A shared home provides privacy. A shared routine allows actions to blend into normal behavior. In this case, Brian Walshe did not need to break into a house or explain why he was present. He was already there. That normalcy, investigators believe, is what allowed the crime to go undetected in its earliest stages. Another key element investigators highlighted was time. According to court records, Brian Walshe was not rushed. There was no immediate search, no public alert, no urgent timeline forcing him to act quickly. Ana's frequent travel created a window where her absence did not immediately raise alarms. Investigators believe Brian exploited that gap, using the first few days after New Year's Day to clean, research, and dispose of evidence before police scrutiny intensified. The internet searches introduced at trial became central to discussions of intent. According to prosecutors, the phrasing and sequencing of the searches suggested not curiosity, but instruction. These were not general questions. They were specific, operational, and increasingly detailed. Legal analysts noted that such searches often appear in cases where suspects believe technology will provide anonymity. Instead, those same searches became one of the strongest indicators of planning. Investigators also examined Brian Walshe's decision to mislead police rather than remain silent. According to experts, lying introduces risk. Every false statement creates a point of contradiction. Prosecutors argued that Brian's changing accounts reflected an attempt to stay ahead of the evidence, but that strategy ultimately failed as digital records contradicted his words. The role of technology in the case cannot be overstated. License plate readers, cell phone tower data, store surveillance cameras, and transaction records collectively created what investigators described as an unbroken chain of movement. Even when Brian used different phones or vehicles, the pattern remained visible. Experts pointed out that crimes once hidden by distance and time are now illuminated by data generated through everyday actions. Another lingering question involved motive. Prosecutors presented financial strain, marital conflict, and impending legal consequences as contributing factors. But investigators acknowledged that motive alone does not cause murder. According to analysts, motive provides context, not explanation. The decision to kill, they argue, is often the result of a convergence of pressures combined with opportunity and a belief in personal control. The children remained a silent presence throughout the case. Prosecutors were careful not to introduce them into the narrative beyond acknowledging their existence. Investigators stated that there was no evidence the children witnessed the crime. However, the psychological impact on them is unavoidable. Experts note that in cases like this, children grow up with fragments of truth shaped by court records and public narratives rather than personal memory. The absence of Ana Walshe's body continues to haunt the case. Investigators have stated that recovery remains unlikely, but not impossible. Advances in forensic search techniques, environmental scanning, and data modeling may one day provide new leads. Until then, the question of where Ana rests remains unanswered. From a broader perspective, the Walshe case has influenced how prosecutors approach similar investigations. According to legal scholars, it reinforces the principle that circumstantial evidence, when layered and corroborated, can be as powerful as direct evidence. It also highlights the importance of early digital preservation, ensuring that electronic records are secured before they can be altered or lost. For the public, the case serves as a reminder that crimes do not always announce themselves with chaos or spectacle. Sometimes they occur quietly, behind closed doors, concealed by routines and assumptions. According to investigators, that quietness is often what makes such cases difficult to detect and emotionally unsettling. As years pass, the story of Ana Walshe will likely be revisited through documentaries, court analyses, and academic studies. Each retelling may emphasize different aspects: the forensic science, the legal strategy, the psychological profile. But at its core, the case remains about a woman who disappeared, a family that lost a mother, and a system that pieced together truth from what was left behind. If you've stayed with us through this investigation, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button for Dark Case Desk. Your engagement ensures that careful, responsible, true crime storytelling continues. In the final segment, Part 4D, we reflect on the legacy of the case, the lessons it leaves behind, and why stories like this continue to matter long after the courtroom lights fade. As the public conversation around the Brian Walshe case slowly quieted, what remained was not a sense of resolution, but a lingering discomfort. According to investigators, this was not unusual. Cases involving intimate relationships and concealed violence often leave behind more questions than answers, even when a verdict is reached. The legal system had done its job, but the human need for understanding extended beyond what the court could provide. The case of Ana Walshe now exists in two parallel realities. One is legal, defined by court records, evidence logs, and a final judgment rendered by a jury of peers. The other is emotional, shaped by absence, memory, and the irreversible loss of a person whose final moments remain unknown. These two realities do not always align, and according to experts, that tension is what keeps cases like this alive in public consciousness long after the headlines fade. Prosecutors have stated that they believe Brian Walshe acted alone. No evidence introduced at trial suggested the involvement of any other individual. Investigators emphasized that the digital trail, purchase history, and surveillance footage all pointed to a single actor. This conclusion, however, does little to ease the unanswered questions surrounding how such a crime unfolded undetected and how someone could believe they would never be held accountable. One of the most enduring lessons of the case is the role of everyday technology. Cell phones, store cameras, vehicle tracking systems, and internet search histories were not designed for criminal investigations, yet they became the most compelling witnesses in the courtroom. According to analysts, this case reinforces a reality that many still underestimate. Modern life generates a continuous record, and attempts to hide within it often leave deeper trails than intended. Law enforcement officials have acknowledged that while the investigation was exhaustive, it was also emotionally taxing. Searching dumpsters, reviewing hours of footage, and reconstructing events without a body placed significant strain on investigators. According to those involved, the determination to pursue the case stemmed not from certainty, but from the belief that silence itself can be evidence when weighed correctly. For Ana Walshe's family, the verdict did not mark an end, but a shift. In statements released after sentencing, they expressed gratitude for the efforts of law enforcement and the jury while acknowledging that closure remained elusive. Without Ana's remains, traditional mourning rituals were impossible. According to grief specialists, this type of loss creates a unique form of trauma, one where acceptance is complicated by uncertainty. The children, shielded from the trial and public discourse, will grow up knowing their mother through stories, photographs, and court documents. Experts note that in such cases, identity and memory are often shaped by what is preserved rather than what is remembered. The responsibility of telling Ana Walshe's story accurately therefore extends beyond the courtroom into the broader narrative shaped by media and public discussion. Legal scholars continue to examine the Walshe case as an example of evolving standards of proof. According to academic commentary, it demonstrates how intent, opportunity, and behavior can collectively meet the burden of proof even in the absence of traditional evidence. It also serves as a cautionary tale about assuming that complexity guarantees concealment. There is no indication that Brian Walshe has disclosed the location of Ana's remains, and investigators have stated that they do not expect further cooperation. The case file remains technically open, allowing for the possibility of future discoveries, however unlikely. According to officials, justice in this case was defined not by recovery, but by accountability. As time passes, the Brian Walshe case will likely become a reference point rather than a headline. It will be cited in courtrooms, studied in law schools, and revisited in documentaries. But at its core, it remains a story about trust, proximity, and the devastating consequences of believing that control can replace responsibility. For those who followed this case from the beginning, the most unsettling truth may be how ordinary it all appeared at first. A quiet home, a familiar routine, a disappearance explained away by work and travel. According to investigators, it is often this ordinariness that allows crimes like this to unfold unnoticed, and why vigilance, documentation, and accountability matter. At Dark Case Desk, our purpose is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to examine it carefully, respectfully, and truthfully. Stories like Ana Walshe's remind us that behind every case file is a real person whose life mattered, and whose absence leaves a permanent mark. If you found this investigation informative, take a moment to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps Dark Case Desk continue delivering responsible, in-depth true crime stories grounded in verified facts, because long after the courtroom doors close, the questions remain, and remembering them is part of how justice endures.